Hi IBC family, welcome again to our Wednesday midweek devotion. Last week I talked a little bit about Joshua and the Israelites, and I talked a little bit about the old generation versus the new. And the old generation, when they were in their season, they decided to just go through their season. They stopped wanting to grow, and they chose to be full for 40 years but never really fulfilled. So I'm going to pick up there and some of the points that we talked about with Joshua, and I'm going to add to that. I'm very excited about this story. Just in today, in my devotion time with God, I just saw some new things, so it's great to see. One of the things I want to talk about and to remind us about is it won't be easy, but it'll be good, because God is good. So the path that we take sometimes is not the easy path, but it's a good one in the end. Don't just stay in provision because it's easier than facing your giants. Push through to the promise, fight to flourish, just like that book from Jenny Lesko. Two, you can't stay where you're at. Don't become complacent and just adapt. The Israelites, they lived in a place they were never called to for 40 years. Don't get distracted. Don't miss wisdom yelling at the intersection. Caleb and Joshua, they were wisdom. They were sitting there going, hey, we can do it. We can take it. Look at what God's done for us. He'll get us there. But instead of listening to them, they turned and listened to the voice of the world, the voice of their friends, the voice of their family. They listened to the 10 others and said, no, that's too hard. That's too rough. I want this route. And they missed it. They didn't hear their father's voice. They missed it. That's something that I speak over my kids every day. We say, we hear the voice of the Father, and the voice of a stranger we will not follow. And I get that from the scripture in John 10:4-5. It says, sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will never on any account follow a stranger, but will run away from him because they do not know the voice of strangers or recognize their call. So important to confess daily that you hear God's voice, and the voice of that stranger you're not going to follow. You're not going to heed it. The last point that I wanted to touch on and really expound on today is remember. Remember you have a promise. Don't let a season cause you to forget a promise. Remember, God is able. Everything that's happening right now, your reality, your hardships, that does not restrict God from being able to do what he wants to do and what he's called you to do. And sometimes it's easy to start off strong, but then storm after storm after storm, or news after news after news, after change after change after change, you get weary and you forget what God has said. But that brings me to one of my favorite verses right now in Deuteronomy 4:29, and I'm reading it out of the Amplified Classic. It says, but from there you will seek the Lord your God. You will find him if you truly seek him with all your heart, all your mind and soul and life. And the part of that verse that I want to focus on is, but if from there. Where? Right there. Right where you are. Whatever you are in right now, there. Whatever your life looks like right now, there. Whatever mess you're in, there. If you seek him, you will find him. If you forgot for a time, that's okay. Start from right there. And if the season has been filled with doubt and despair and hardship and hurt and pain and hopelessness, from right there, right where you're standing right now, just stop and seek God, and you will find him. And he will remind you of the path that he wants for you. And he will remind you of the promise that he has for you. And although the season has been hard and crazy, none of that has changed the course that he has for you. Might change a little bit how you're getting there, but it doesn't change that you're still going to get there. So, but from there, if you seek him, you will find him. Sometimes when you have this conversation, you hear, well, you just don't understand. You don't know how hard it's been. You don't know how long I've waited. You don't know the struggle. And that brings me back to Joshua, because Joshua was at the promised land, but he had to wait for 40 years. The struggle is real, guys. That dude knew he was right. He was in the promised land. God was backing him, and yet he had to walk out of the promised land due to the choices of others. And I paused there for a minute because there's so much I could say about this moment with Joshua, but I'm just gonna throw out two little nutshells if you have me. One, don't let other people walk you out of what God has for you, and that comes back to being careful of whose voice you listen to. Joshua was in the promised land and he walked out because of others' choices. But with Joshua in particular, I want you to understand that Joshua knew he was right. He knew that that was what God had called him to, but he walked out because he was demonstrating love, he was demonstrating respect, and he was submitting under the authority of Moses. Moses was still in charge, and Moses was who was still talking to God and in direct contact with God. And a part of me, I mean, we don't get to know the full story with Joshua, but a part of me wonders the conversations he had with God of, I know I'm right. I know that this is where we're supposed to be. You know, maybe it was a conversation of, let me get a group together and we just do this thing. But instead, somewhere in there, God said, wait. Joshua was right, and he was, he had God in his corner, but yet he walked out and waited. And that demonstrated love, and it demonstrated respect, and it demonstrated the wisdom of God that he waited. But one thing about Joshua and Caleb is that they remembered. They refused to just stay in this place and become content. And it wasn't easy, but they didn't give up. During the season of struggle and disappointment and frustration. And 40 years knowing you're right and where you could be would be frustrating and disappointing. But still they waited, trusting God and remembering that God will bring them to where they're supposed to be. And then when God said, okay, it's time, Joshua said, get ready, let's do this. And that brings us to Joshua 1:10-11 again, where he said, get ready. Prepare your provisions, for within 3 days we're going to pass over the Jordan to go in and take possession of the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess. I want to focus really quick on that moment too. Joshua said, in 3 days we're going to pass over or cross over the Jordan. Now the Jordan River, it's not a small creek. It's a big river. And in normal season, it flows at about 4 miles per hour. But scholars believe that during this moment and this crossing, it was flood season, because in Joshua 3:15 it says, the Jordan was overflowing its banks due to harvest season, and that meant flood season. And in flood season, the Jordan is about 180 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and flows at about 10 miles per hour. So when Joshua said, hey, in 3 days we're going to cross over the Jordan, there was a moment in all those people's minds where they were like, yeah, no. That's a big fat no. I mean, they looked at it and they were like, this is too hard. I can't do this. No way. That they had that feeling of impossible, but faith goes with the unbelievable. And that's why it's so important to lift up and look from, instead of let down and look at where you're at. They weren't looking at the river. They had to lift their eyes and look past that river to Jericho. They had to keep their eyes on Jericho and on the promise and where they were going, and not just focus at the river. If they let down their eyes, they could have chosen the same path that their ancestors took. If you think about it, it's about a full circle, because their ancestors, the last generation, they were at this point of go conquer the giants or opt out. So now they're at this point of look at this giant river. This dude says we're going to cross it in 3 days. And they're at the same pivotal point of, do we look down at the problem, say this is too difficult and walk? Or do we look from the place that we are to what God has for us and not focus on the river and the problem in front of us? And I just want to focus too, that was that word remember. In Joshua 1:13, for time's sake, I'm not going to read all of it, but if you keep reading right after that verse on 11, 12-18, all Joshua did in those verses is he reminded them of who God was, of what God has called them to. Even right here in verse 14, your wives, your little ones, and your cattle shall dwell in the land which Moses gave you on this side of the Jordan. But all your mighty men of valor shall pass on before your brethren, armed, and help them possess their land. And he just goes on and continues to say, the Lord your God is giving you a place of rest. He's giving you this land. I mean, the verses are just filled with him reminding them of God and his promise. He's reminding them of who they are and who God is. And sometimes it's so hard to lift up your eyes and look from, but that's where that remembering comes into place. And that's where Deuteronomy 4:29, but from there, at that moment where they were standing, they had to stop, seek God, find him, and remember that God's done all of these things. And despite what this looks like, that's where we're going, and God's promised it. And Joshua just filled them with remembrance, and I love that. Now watch this. So in Joshua, we jump all the way to Joshua 3:6, and he said, the priests will take up the ark and they will step in the river first. This is such a key moment. Maybe you've tried to cross a problem before, but you didn't let God go first. Joshua put God first into the Jordan, into the problem he needed to cross over. He put God first. If God be for you, who can go against you? But God has to be before you. He has to go first before you cross over the problems in your life. And that kind of brings me back to that moment of Joshua when he walked out of the promised land. You got to wonder when he was having that conversation, maybe God wasn't ready to go before him for that. And him walking over there or getting people to go with him would have been in his own power and not God going first. So God had to go first. Next, it wasn't before they stepped. They didn't stop at the riverbank and the Jordan receded. They had to take the first step. Then God. They took the first step and it stopped. The river receded. And it was the beginning of so many miracles. If you don't know the story, I highly recommend you read it. But after they stepped into that river, it was miracle after miracle after miracle, and they were able to conquer and possess all that God had called them to. But it started with that step. It started with God going before them, with them keeping their eyes lifted up and looking from, hearing the voice of God, and taking that step. I want to end back at Deuteronomy 4:29, but I'm going to add in 2 more verses, verse 30 and 31. So bear with me. But if from there you will seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you truly seek him with all your heart, mind, soul, and life. And when you are in tribulation, which is a hard and painful season, and all these things are coming upon you, when it feels like it rains, it pours, right? In the latter days you will turn to the Lord your God and be obedient to his voice. That's taking the first step. Putting God first, tuning into his voice, the voice of wisdom. And it goes on with, for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not fail you or destroy you or forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore them. This is all that remembering, the reminding that God is for you. He is a good God. He is able, he is willing, and he has promised, his promises still stand. But from there, right there where you are in this moment, stop and seek him and you will find him. Have a great week. See you next Wednesday. Bye.